Okay, so when I came down to the NIH after my residency in 1968, it was a period of time when we were just starting to get insight about the human immune system. It was an infant field. It wasn't what it is now with all the technologies that we have. And I had this dual interest of infectious diseases and the immune system and how the immune system responds. And I was fascinated by the intricacies of how the immune system was regulated. And because I became interested in that, even though I was clinically, fundamentally an infectious disease person, I kind of switched my interest, not giving up the interest in infectious diseases, about studying is how the immune system is regulated. And there are a number of diseases of hyperactivation of the immune system, referred to as autoinflammatory or autoimmune diseases. 2 or 3 in particular were very lethal with almost 100% mortality. One was called, it used to be called Wegener's granulomatosis, now it's called granulomatosis with vasculitis. Strange names, not rare but unusual diseases, polyarteritis nodosa, some of the other autoimmune diseases. And some of them were highly lethal. You would get pulmonary failure, you would get renal failure, and the patients would die. And since I was interested in the immune system, I was saying, is there any way that we can suppress the immune system enough to suppress the disease, but not enough to make a person susceptible to the secondary infections you get when you knock out someone's immune system? So, for example, the drugs that we used for cancer, cyclophosphamide, a variety of other drugs, when given to people who have cancer, you want to completely kill all the cells. The problem is those people are susceptible then to a lot of things like infections and bleeding because platelets go low. So when I came to the NIH, I had a mentor named Sheldon Wolf, who was an amazing person in that he gave me at a very young age a group of patients to work with him and figure out how we can study them. And it happened that in the National Cancer Institute, which was 2 floors away from us in the old building, where I would go up there all the time as the infectious diseases consult because they were getting immunosuppressed and they were getting infections. And when you look at the drugs that they were being treated with, they were being treated with massive doses of these cytotoxic drugs. So we got the idea that if we could somehow give a cancer drug at a low enough dose, but monitor the immune function and the white cell function of the people enough to kind of titrate the dose, could you turn the disease off without any of the secondary complications? And we did. And we took a disease that was 98% fatal, and we had 93% remission rates in that. And while I did that, I used it as a model to dissect out how the immune system is regulated, what can be turned off, what interacts with that. So from way back then, we used that model to create therapies that would have been unheard of. It was very daring to do that then, to give, I mean, people looked at me like I was crazy. Why? You're giving a cancer drug to someone who doesn't have cancer? And the answer was, well, if you do it carefully and monitor them, you can shut off selectively the aberrant immune response without necessarily shutting off the immune response that protects you against a variety of infections. And that's really what I was doing very successfully, and I became probably prematurely well known because of that for a period of time for around, I would say 9 years or so. And just as a stroke of fate, I always had this nagging feeling about, wanting to do something that is involved fundamentally infectious diseases, that involved, things that were broadly impacting globally. And then, almost like a quirk of fate, I was duly trained as an immunologist, which now I had been doing immunology, clinical immunology for a while. I was clearly a very board certified and accomplished infectious disease person. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, in 1981, comes a disease that is clearly an infectious disease that's impacting the immune system. Like, we've never seen anything like that. But how could you have an infectious disease that actually attacks the immune system? And we didn't know it at the time, but that's when I made a dramatic sea change in my career. And I said, I've been very well accomplished for the past 9 years doing these very interesting things with autoimmune inflammatory diseases. And now we have this group of people, strangely, virtually all gay men, who are presenting with a disease that looks, smells, and acts like an infectious disease, and it's destroying their immune system. What the hell is going on here? So I decided that I was going to say, hey, I've made a lot of accomplishments here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to focus my attention, and this was 1981, on bringing in these patients and trying to figure out what's going on with them. And for a couple of years before the virus was discovered by Montagnier and then by Gallo to prove that it did, we were seeing things that were amazing. You almost couldn't make it up. We had a ward full of young, almost all gay men who were otherwise well, who would come in with the most devastating opportunistic infections. And it was that kind of involvement back then with very little attention paid by the public or the government at the time. That was another triggering thing for me to make a career change. And the career change was I had always been a in the trenches physician, an at the bench scientist. I looked down upon administration. Oh my God, administration, what a bunch of stodgy people who don't know what they're doing. And then the directorship of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases opened up in 1984 because the current director went down to become dean of the medical school at Emory. So they asked me if I wanted to do that. Traditionally, before then, directors never saw patients and they never had any labs. So I figured I had nothing left to lose. So I said, I'll be happy to do this, but what I had in mind was if I did it, I was going to take this sleepy field of infectious diseases, which was like the 6th or 7th largest institute at NIH, with a budget that was like 300, less than that. It was sort of about $300 million at the time. And I was going to make it something bigger and particularly I was going to use it as the bully pulpit to get attention to HIV/AIDS. So I told the appropriate people who were picking that I'd be happy to take the job, but A, I have to still be able to see patients, and B, I have to continue to run my lab. And they said, my God, you can't do all three. Nobody's ever done all three. I said, fine, then I won't do the job. I said, but I promise you I would make sure that my primary interest would be running the institute in a broad way and not just focus on what I'm doing. So the rather insightful director of the NIH at the time, a man named James Weingarten, said, okay, give it a shot. I think you could do it. And that's when I had multiple hats. I came in, I became a director. I did things that had to do with broad global health issues at the same time as I continued to work very, very intensively on trying to delineate the nature of the defect in HIV/AIDS. And that's really what I've been doing since. That was a very interesting period that has continued to the day because now those very activists are my dear friends, my comrades, my collaborators. Back then, there were a couple of things that were going on that caused the activist community to galvanize and try to gain attention. Number one, the first administration of Reagan didn't take this as seriously as they should have. Secondly, even as we got into understanding that it was a virus and we were developing drugs, the rigidity of the scientific community, the regulatory community, and even in many respects, the budgetary approach towards something was not commensurate with the reality and the potential for this catastrophe that was unfolding for us. And it triggered a sea change in both the scientific and the regulatory community. And I was sort of in the eye of that hurricane because I was so involved and devoted to doing something about this horrible thing that was happening that I became a very visible person. I was testifying hundreds of times. I mean, literally hundreds. In total now, after the 33 years I've been director, I probably testified before Congress more than anybody, purely because of the longevity of what I do. But there was constant that in the newspapers with interviews all the time. So my face was the face of the federal government. Most scientists would, do their thing and not be visible. And then it became clear that when we had clinical trials, we, the scientific community and the regulatory community, did not listen to them because they wanted to be part of the discussion of how you design a trial, of how you get a drug available or not. But no one was listening to them because it was at the time an attitude that many of us had, and I probably had it myself, but I changed pretty quickly. And that was, we're scientists, we're regulators, we know better than you. So, meanwhile, they have a disease, they see all of their friends dying, and we say, well, a new drug takes X number of years to get through the process of the standard clinical trial. And activists were saying, wait a minute, if I look at my friends, I probably have about a year and a half to live. So, but yet no one was paying attention to them. So they decided that they were going to gain the attention of the establishment. And since I was quite visible at the time, I was the establishment, they decided that they were going to focus it on me. And it was very interesting. They focused it on me essentially because I was the head of the institute, but they also did it to some of the other scientists who ran for the hills, don't want to deal with them. So they got my attention. They did some amazing things, not only to me, but they, in New York City, they closed down Wall Street. They broke into St. Patrick's Cathedral during the middle of a mass and grabbed the chalice from the priest. I mean, they did things to gain attention. Everybody thought that was horrible. But when I was looking at it and I was starting to read about the kinds of things that they were asking for, if you put aside the histrionics and the theatrics, they were making perfect sense. And we were the ones that were not getting it. My attention was gotten by several things. They've invaded the NIH and with smoke bombs and things. And then there was one figure who was sort of like the grandfather or the father of the activist movement named Larry Kramer, who was a very well-known Academy Award-nominated screenwriter, a playwright, an author. And he wrote an article in the San Francisco Examiner, I think, a Sunday magazine section, which was just phenomenal. I still have a picture of it. It says, I call you murderer, an open letter to an incompetent idiot, Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of NIAID. So I said, woo, that really got my attention. But even before that, I was starting to listen to the things that they were saying. Some of the things were off base. They weren't making any sense. But the core thing that they wanted is that they wanted to be heard about designing something that wasn't so rigid. I'll give you a simple example of it that I became very well known for and became a hero among the activist community for working with them to establish this thing called parallel track. So it was an interesting story that early on, before we had the life-saving, dramatic drugs that we have right now, there was one drug that was helpful but certainly didn't suppress the virus. It sort of temporarily suppressed the virus, called AZT. People who back then remember AZT. Well, when we were starting to test drugs for the opportunistic infections, one of the infections was an infection called cytomegalovirus, which in people whose immune system was suppressed, it had some devastating consequences, one of which it chewed away at the retina and you lost your vision. And when a trial was designed to see if it works, and many of the patients with HIV infection were getting cytomegalovirus and some of them were going blind. And the protocol said from the FDA, and you understand why they did it, it was reasonable, in order to see if this drug ganciclovir works against CMV, you wanted a pristine situation. So you couldn't be on any other drugs. And you had to have the right laboratory data so that they could determine if it works. Now, the only ones who really needed that were HIV-infected individuals. And I remember something that just struck me so much, it was a major turnaround for me. And that is one of the activists from San Francisco, Marty Delaney, who was a phenomenal guy. I really related to him because he started off as a Jesuit priest and then dropped out, was a gay guy, and he was an activist. And he invited me to San Francisco and he said, I want to show you something. So he took me to the Castro district. And we went into the room of a young man who was clearly debilitated from HIV, was being taken care of by his partner. And the guy was in bed. And again, I was the one that was felt to be controlling all of this, even though I didn't control it all. And he said, I'm on AZT, and it's prolonging my life. I have cytomegalovirus in my eye, and I want to get on a protocol to get ganciclovir. But I'm told I can either be on AZT or I can be on ganciclovir, but I can't be on both. And he looked at me and he says, what kind of a choice is that? You're telling me I should either die or go blind, but I can't do both. And when he said that, I said, oh my God, this is really nuts. And that's when I became a real, almost confrontative activist against my own government that was not allowing these things to happen. And it was a tough road. And the road was tough because the scientific community was thinking that I sold out to the activists. And I had a lot of scientists who were saying, what the hell happened to Fauci? You know, he's given in to these crazy people who are stomping on the campus. But that was a good start because that gave me creds with the activist community. And then even though they did things that was still very iconoclastic, we developed a certain trust that has now stayed with us through the years. You know, amazing psychology of it. I mean, it's a lesson that, you know, in many respects is beautiful. I mean, I remember when the NIH was invaded, as it were. That movie, that documentary, How to Survive a Plague. They show the smoke bombs going off at the NIH. Well, a month before, one of the organizers, Peter Staley, who has become quite a good friend, I mean, a really good friend of mine right now, we used to bring him down to Washington, the activists, after we got rid of this confrontational thing. We used to sit down in my deputy's Capitol Hill townhouse, and we used to sit down and have a meal and talk about, you know, how are we going to reconcile these things? How are we going to get more money? How are we going to do this? How are we going to do that? And he said, you know what we really need to do to gain attention? We're gonna just invade the NIH and throw off smoke bombs because we really, you know, want to create attention. And here I am having a glass of Pinot Grigio with this guy, and he says, you know, I love you, Tony, but we're gonna do it. And they did it. And they did it at the same time that we were friends. So they knew that kind of iconoclastic stuff would gain attention, and only when you would gain attention. This is the same guy that put the giant condom over Jesse Helms' house. You remember that? So we were on the show, and you're absolutely right. He was ripping me. Yo, you do this, you're a flunky for the minute, blah, 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 blah. Why don't you just, you know, lie down on the grass in the White House and, you know, set yourself on fire or something like that? It was really, but that's the beauty of Larry Kramer. I mean, he sometimes acts a little weird, but he's got the passion that really does it. So he was in New York, and I was in the studio down at wherever C-SPAN was on North Capitol Street. So I come back home, and when I get home, about 15 minutes after walking in, I get a phone call. It's Larry. He said, "I thought that went really well. What did you think?" And I says, "It depends on what you mean, Larry." But what he meant by that is that he got his points across. So he really didn't interpret, given that phase of our relationship, that was part of the act. I attack and I make my points. So that's when he says, "I thought that really went well." And I said, "Okay, all right, it went well." So I joke around with various assistant secretaries and various directors of NIH over the years. So I started off with a budget of about $300 million. My budget is now close to $5 billion. So if I were a Wall Street mogul, I would get some kind of a golden parachute or something there, but not. So what happened was a series of events, and that's why when I talk to students and fellows, when I give commencement addresses, particularly at medical schools, I say, you really have to keep an open mind, because a lot of times things that dramatically influence you in your life are things that you don't plan. They're completely unanticipated, and you have to have the training and the insight and foresight to see that maybe this is an opportunity. I did that when I stopped doing my autoimmune work and switched to HIV/AIDS. I did that when I became the director of NIAID, and then I realized that as a director of this institute, when you had challenges like outbreaks and influenza and anthrax and all those kinds of things, that what we needed was a scientist who was a serious scientist who could articulate to the White House, to the Congress, and to the public the kinds of things that are important and that we need. And that's something that I never would have predicted in my wildest dreams when I was back doing what I was doing, that's what I would be doing. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, at a time when there was a lot of community, I wouldn't say segregation, but division, where the neighborhood of Bensonhurst was almost exclusively an Italian-American neighborhood. People who were either born in Italy and moved to New York and then had children who then had children. So I was second generation. My father was born in New York City, was actually born in Little Italy in Manhattan. His father and mother came over from Italy at the turn of the century, in the very early 20th century. They worked in New York City, moved to Brooklyn, which at the time was a move up to go from the Little Italy section. And that's where my mother and father grew up. My mother's parents, very similar to my father's parents, again, both were born in Italy and immigrated to the United States in the very early part of the 20th century. And again, settled in the Little Italy section. My mother and father met in Brooklyn, literally in elementary school, got married right after high school, and I was born and raised in that neighborhood, and I was in that neighborhood until I went off to college and then went off to medical school. My father was a pharmacist. My mother went to Hunter College, but as soon as she had children, my sister, who's 3 years older than I am, she then became a housewife mother to the family. My mother's father and mother, my grandmother on my mother's side, was a dressmaker and a homemaker. She took care of the children and worked and literally supported the family because her husband, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was an artist, somewhat of a bohemian kind of a person who used to hang out in Greenwich Village with his artist friends. And he did some great painting, but he didn't really make much money, so he was supported by my grandmother. my paternal grandfather, when he came over from Italy, members of his family had already been here and opened up some pretty substantial businesses, particularly a discipline called stevedore, namely the people who unload and clean the ships in the New York harbor. So he was a pretty bright guy, my paternal grandfather, so they made him the accountant and financial manager of this organization, which was called American Stevedores. So he did pretty well, and I would think that my father grew up, and even though it was an immigrant family, grew up reasonably comfortable. Certainly not wealthy by any means, but not street kid who had to go out and sell fruit on the street corner. He was a reasonably well-established family. I was very close to my grandfather on my father's side. He was an amazing guy, a very strong personality, but a very kind person who took a very special liking to me and would be the babysitter when my parents would go out to any social event. And at a time when my mother had chores and would have to leave, she would leave me with my grandfather. And it was a very interesting phenomenon because he didn't speak hardly any English at all. He could understand English, but when he spoke and felt comfortable about speaking, he would speak in Italian. And it was an interesting circuitry of the brain because from the time I was born until the time I went to elementary school in Brooklyn, when he was taking care of us, he would speak to me in Italian. And I would understand everything he was saying, but I couldn't speak Italian back to him. So I would speak English. And I still have some of those deep down in the recesses of your brain sometimes when I travel to give lectures or whatever to go to Italy and I hear people speaking, even though I cannot speak Italian, it's kind of flashbacks of things that they were saying. Anyway, it was a great relationship. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. My father went to Columbia University College of Pharmacy in New York City. And when he graduated and came out, he worked in various pharmacies. And at a certain point in his life, his father, my grandfather, who was, as I mentioned, from a financial standpoint, reasonably well, helped finance him buying a pharmacy, which he did, and he owned the drugstore where we lived. It was kind of an interesting story. I think common among families like this, where he bought a drugstore on 83rd Street and 13th Avenue. And that's when we moved from the Bensonhurst section to a little bit more of a highfalutin section, Dyker Heights, which was a little bit more financially prosperous than the Bensonhurst section. And he owned the drugstore, and my sister and I and my mother and father lived in the apartments above the drugstore. So he owned the building, and we lived on the top of that. And that's where I lived until I went away to college. It was a pharmacy that was right across the street from St. Bernadette's Church. And what we used to do is that when the masses would finish on a Sunday, there would be crowds and crowds of people that would come into the pharmacy, and not only just for prescriptions, but for cosmetics and things like that. So from a very, very early age, I would help out behind the counter with the cash register and wrapping things. But in the summers and sometimes in the evenings, I would use my Schwinn bike with its little basket and deliver prescriptions to the neighborhood people. So back then, it was very common for calling up the pharmacy or getting a prescription done, and you would deliver it to the house. And that's what I remember doing from the time I could ride my bicycle. Everything is free in Regis High School. And at the time, it was a very unusual way that they would get people to. It still is and was then an all-boys school. And what they did, it was an endowed school run by the Jesuit priests, and at the time there were almost all Jesuit priests and scholastics who were priests in training before they become priests, were the ones that were teaching there. And what they would do is that every elementary school in the 5 boroughs, in addition to some in the Connecticut, New Jersey area, because we had kids in our class who were from Jersey City and places like that, the top person in the class that was picked by the nuns, who were usually nuns, sometimes brothers, from these elementary schools, would go to a testing place in Manhattan, and they would give an exam, a comprehensive exam. And they would pick the people who would be the incoming freshman class by going to the top X number of people on the exam. So you had to have been put forth as the representative of your elementary school. You would take an exam, and then depending upon where you ranked in the exam, you would get into Regis High School. So academically, it was extraordinary. New York City has some extraordinary schools. The Bronx High School of Science is one of the elite science things. So I would say that, you could say this and it's the truth. It was kind of the Bronx High School of Science for Catholic kids who went to elementary school. And it was really extraordinary because you had kids from there from all over the city. It wasn't like you have a school that, people from the particular district. It was from all over: Manhattan, Bronx, Staten Island, Queens, Brooklyn, some from Connecticut, some as far away as New Jersey. So it was a very, very good mixture of people from different backgrounds. I became a real subway jockey from a very early age there. That's so I think of it now, and it's almost unbelievable. So I would have to take a bus from my house to a local train that was then called the BMT, Brooklyn Manhattan Transit. They have different names now in New York, and I don't even know what they are. So I would take that local from a certain station to the express stop and switch to the BMT Express, which would go to 14th Street and Union Square in Manhattan, at which point I'd switch to the IRT, or Interborough Rapid Transit was called then, from 14th Street up to 86th Street and Lexington Avenue, get out and walk from 86th and Lex to 85th and Madison, where the school was. I was a captain and high scorer of the basketball team, right? That was the day of the two-handed jump shot and the fast break, and you didn't have to be very good at a jump shot because we didn't take jump shots. Then it was mostly fast break, set shots, and things like that. And I was very good at that at the time. And then I realized I really wanted to become a serious athlete in college. And a very interesting story that really was one of those things in life where you get convinced that this is not for you. So at a high school level, I was really quite good. And as we were getting ready, junior and senior year, our coach, who was a really great coach, would have the varsity, and I made the varsity in my sophomore year. So I went from the freshman team right onto the varsity. So I played varsity for 3 years in high school. They would have the varsity from the high school. He would make a deal with the colleges in the New York area that their freshman team would scrimmage with us as the varsity high school. So you had a freshman college team would scrimmage with the varsity high school team. And then I got to realize what a really good basketball players were, because I soon learned, and I tell a joke about this, but it's true. I soon learned that a 6'3", really fast point guard who can shoot will always destroy a 5'7", really good point guard who could shoot. And that was my realization. Okay, I think maybe there's something else in my career besides basketball. Oh yeah, I mean it was long days, and with basketball practice, particularly if you had to go up, which we did often. We used to go up and scrimmage in the Harlem Boys Club up in Lenox Avenue on 114th, 118th Street, go up to the Bronx and play. So by the time you finished school, went up, practiced basketball, came back down, you got home, it was clearly dark even during the springtime. And the rule then was very disciplined in studying. So the Jesuits say, I don't care how you do it, but you're going to study 3 hours a night because we're going to give you enough work to study 3 hours a night. And the reason I think, one of the reasons why I became very disciplined and could multitask a lot of the things that I do now, is you had to rigidly, even at age 14, 15, 16, 17, rigidly organize what you're going to do. Like you have this to do, you're going to do this on the train, you're going to do this on the way back, you're going to get home, you're going to eat, and you're going to do this, then you're going to get up and you're going to do the next thing. And you had to have a very organized life, which, seems now retrospectively a little nuts for a young kid to have to do that. But it was great training. It was great training. And the Jesuits have a very wonderful way of being highly academic and intellectual about things, always asking you to question things and always consider what it means more globally than just for yourself. So, yeah, in high school, as part of the required curriculum, was 4 years of Latin and 3 or 4 years of Greek and 3 years of a Romance language. I picked French, as well as the other things that you do in high school, math, English. Then I took some science courses, biology and things like that. But it was very, very heavily weighted to the classics, and that continued over. It was something that I tell my children about, and they shake their heads in disbelief. When I graduated from Regis, the Jesuits would essentially tell you what college you're going to be going to, that you're a really smart guy and you want to go into pre-med, so you're going to go to Holy Cross. And they wouldn't write a recommendation for you if you decided you wanted to apply to Harvard or to Cornell or Columbia. So I went to Holy Cross, College of Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, which was a very interesting place because it had a spectacularly good and highly rated pre-med program. And what I did when I went there, and retrospectively, it was really a good idea for what I do now in life and the kinds of things I have to deal with. It was a pre-med course which had this strange, almost oxymoronic name of Bachelor of Arts, Greek Classics - pre-med. So you didn't get a Bachelor of Science, you got a Bachelor of Arts, and I took over 25 credits of philosophy, as well as 2 years of Greek, 2 years of Latin, 2 years of French, and then enough of the sciences to get into medical school. But it was very heavily steeped in philosophy, and I was taking, and you talk to people now, why would a pre-med want to do this? Metaphysics, ethics, philosophical psychology, all those kinds of things that I still can't remember at all what it was all about back then, but I did that. And so I graduated with a very much of a humanitarian, classics, humanities background. And I went to medical school, and that's when I came back to New York City at Cornell University Medical Center, which is where I really wanted to go. Well, it was more Regis High School together with what I learned. And it was the atmosphere of having around you an extraordinarily diverse group of kids who were picked purely on their academic ability. That's it. You don't get in because you know somebody. It's purely on your academic ability. And you had the Jesuit tradition, which taught you a couple of things, more than a couple of things. But one of them was you strive for excellence and nothing else. Don't go crazy about it if you don't accomplish something, but at least you strive for excellence always. And their motto is, it was only men then, it was men for others. So what you do has to be guided by something that would be better for mankind. It was not, I wouldn't say discouraged, but it never got into the dialogue of, I'm going to do this for self-advancement. It's always do it, self-advancement would come, but the reason why you should be doing things is for others. And that was kind of, you wouldn't say drilled into you, it was, that's the way it was. And when you went there and learned that, that became part of your personality, that you was striving for excellence always, but the issue of service to others, one way or another. And they didn't say that everybody had to be a public servant or everybody had to be a doctor. You could go and be a Wall Street magnate if you wanted to, but you had to keep in mind that what you did had to have some aspect of it that would be good for other people. And that was taught right from the minute you walked into the school. I went back there for one of their anniversaries and gave a couple of lectures, and it's still the same. Not as many priests. That's the thing. We had maybe 85%, 90% priests and scholastics, and the scholastics were young Jesuits in training, and a few lay teachers. I went back there now. There may be 3 or 4 or 5 Jesuits and 100 lay teachers, because very few people are going into the priesthood right now. People who hear stories about medical school would think I'm a little bit off kilt by saying this, but I absolutely loved medical school. I mean, when I got to medical school, that was, I think, the real, true birth of the Tony Fauci that I am today. I mean, medical school was absolutely made for me, and I was made for medical school. I absolutely loved it. I loved it because the curve of learning and then applying it to things that, A, are important, that you care about, and that are fulfilling that thing that has been subconsciously drilled into your midbrain, the idea about doing things for others. So I absolutely loved medical school. I loved my internship and my residency. At the time, it was different than it is today. I can't make judgment better or worse, but now, you're on for a certain number of hours, and then you have to leave, and you can't be tired. Back then, when I was an intern and a couple of years of residency and then a chief residency, we were on every other night and every other weekend, and you never, ever left the hospital unless your patient was stable. So you may be on every other night and every other weekend, but there were days in a row when you just wouldn't leave. You take a cat nap here and a cat nap there, and you wouldn't go. Now, if you're the kind of person that doesn't function well under that, that's dangerous, and that's a good reason why there are restrictions now. But if you happen to be somewhat of a type 1 maniac the way I am, that feeds right into the things you love. I mean, just doing that and doing all of those very important things and realizing that sometimes when you're really tired, you could just pull yourself up and get it done, and just, that the terminology that my daughters use now was sort of born then, like, suck it up and do it. And that's what we did. So I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that. I don't really remember anything that I really screwed up badly to the point where it was like, oh my God, what did I do? When you're in medicine, it's always a learning experience. And that's the reason why you really got to take it very, very seriously. I think maybe I've been fortunate. I mean, I've seen really, really good doctors get into situations where through no fault of their own or something that was an accident, you slipped up and you say, oh my God, what have I done? Fortunately, I've not had that happen. I've been in situations where people didn't make it that you always question, could I have done something differently? But you can't second guess yourself on that. Taking care of someone who is really sick surprised me because depending upon what your fundamental nature is, and this isn't good or bad or better than something, it's just the way you are, is that for me, the sicker the patient, the better I functioned. And that's why I went into infectious diseases ultimately, because it's such a dramatic aspect of medicine. You die or you get better, that kind of thing. But I loved every aspect of medicine. I mean, probably the most enjoyable part of my medical school was something I didn't do, ultimately, was OBGYN, was just delivering babies. I mean, the phenomenon of delivering babies was amazing. What has happened, that was a decision I made upon advice from an old friend who actually spent several years in the Nixon White House. And I would have hoped that I would have felt this way anyway, is that one of the things you have to do, and you really have almost a moral responsibility to do it, because you're dealing with the president and you're dealing with things that can affect the lives of many people. And that is, you have got to be totally honest and give advice and analysis that you're asked to give that's based on evidence. And if the analysis that you comes to a conclusion that a president might not like to hear that, you can't be afraid of saying, Mr. President, with all due respect, this is the way I think the situation is. And what this person told me was that what you need to do is that when you go to the White House, always say in the back of your mind that this may be the last time I'm going there, because I might have to tell this president something he doesn't like. And sometimes you people, not only presidents, you tell them something they don't like, they don't want to hear it, and they don't ask you back again. And one of the first times that I had to do that was with Vice President Bush and then President Bush. And I developed a reputation in White House circles because, you know, the White House is an interesting place. Someone who's a junior staffer in this administration, and 2 administrations later, is going to be the deputy chief of staff. I mean, that's just the way it works. So I developed over the years a reputation that I would speak the truth and give you advice and discussion based on evidence and not on my trying to ingratiate myself with you. And that the word got out. It got out in front of the Congress, and it got out among not only presidents, but the people who staff the White House, because they know people who are staffers in the Senate become staffers in the White House, and it's a lot of almost like a family of people that get to know each other. And what's happened over the years is that I've been very honest. I've given my best opinion based on the evidence, and people respect that. So I've had to tell presidents sometimes things that they didn't like. But they keep asking me back because they know I'm going to give them an honest opinion. When Vice President George H.W. Bush was vice president, he was preparing to run for president, and he came and asked the NIH director, who was Jim Weingarten at the time, I really want to learn a little bit about HIV. I hear there's this guy Fauci out there that I see on the news and stuff like that. This was in 1987, the beginning of 1988. He had already figured out he wanted to run for president. So he came to the NIH, and he introduced himself to me, and I showed him my patients. I brought him into the room. He came with Barbara. Also in that entourage was a young man named George W. Bush, who was a staffer in the White House. This was after he became president. He became a staffer. But when he was vice president and George W. Bush wasn't quite there yet, he was still, in Texas or wherever he was, he came to the NIH, and we developed a rapport and a friendship that I still to this day, feel so blessed to having done that. He all of a sudden, started inviting me to the vice president's mansion, to Christmas parties, to brunches and lunches over his house, and would call me up asking me advice about, what about this in medicine? What about this? What do you think about that? And then when he became the NIH, the president of the United States, was when this thing happened in San Francisco. And it's a very interesting story, but it's true. It's really wonderful, is that we became, to the extent that you can do it without, but we became as friendly as you can be. He was just a wonderful, wonderful human being. The activists felt he wasn't doing enough for HIV, so they were getting pissed off at me because I was friends with the president. So Larry Kramer's famous thing is, you need to chain yourself to the gate of the White House and demand that we have much more money. And I say, Larry, I have a relationship with the president, and gradually we're getting a lot more money. If I chain myself to the White House fence, you will feel gratified. I'll be a hero for 15 minutes, and that'll be the end of our access to the White House. So anyway, I became very good friends with the then president, and he would come to the NIH multiple times. So when I wanted to come out, and when I went to San Francisco, and this guy told me, the way you're doing these protocols is ridiculous. You want me to either go blind or die. Marty Delaney, who brought me to San Francisco, arranged the town hall meeting. And in the town hall meeting, as I was getting ready to go out, the press was really agitating. What are you going to do about this inability to access clinical trials? And there was a concept called parallel track, which Jim Igo, who was an activist from ACT UP New York, and Marty Delaney, who was an activist for Project Inform, were pushing for us. The FDA Korea people were deadly against it, understandably. In fact, I wasn't harsh with them because they feel that's not the way you do it. You can't do it. You'll violate the principles of a clinical trial. So as I was getting ready to go out on the stage, Marty, who I loved, I became his consulting physician with him when he ultimately died, and a great man. He said, "Tony, please get out there and do it." And do it means say I come out that we have to change the way we do these clinical trials, and we have to have parallel approaches for people who can't fit into a clinical trial to have access to the drugs without interfering with the scientific aspects of the trial. It was referred to as parallel track. So I went out there and I got up on stage and I said, I had scripted remarks, but I'm going to throw them away. I said, let me just say that I'm convinced now with this visit that we really have to have a sea change in what we do. I didn't clear it with the White House. I didn't clear it with the FDA. I didn't clear it with anybody. Unbeknownst to me, right there was Randy Schultz, the guy who wrote the book and the band played on, and he was a reporter at the time for the San Francisco Chronicle or whatever. There was somebody from the LA Times, and Gina Colada from the New York Times had heard about it. So the next thing I knew, it was like front page of the New York Times. Leading NIH official, government official, goes against the FDA, this or that. And I said, oh my God, I really didn't think it was going to have that much. So I flew back took the red eye and flew back to the NIH. And when I got there, much to I thought it was dismay, I get a phone call from John Sununu. And John says, Tony, what happened out there? And I said, John, it really needed to happen. He said, the president, just needs to get filled in on this, what's going on. So I explained it to him. And I said, this is really the right thing to do. And the next thing he says, okay, I'll tell the boss and see what happened. And then the next thing I knew, I was asked down to the White House for something else, and the president says, I think that was the right thing to do. Fast forward X number of years, I was given the Public Health something distinguished award for doing this. So I thought I was going to get fired for it, and it turned out I got an award. But the relationship with George H.W. Bush was really an interesting relationship because he wanted very much for me to be the director of NIH. And it was kind of an interesting situation where I didn't want to do that because I didn't want to get out of the AIDS business. I said, I know I can multitask, but I really wanted to be the director of NIAID. I wanted to do infectious diseases, and I wanted to lead the AIDS effort. So he asked me to be, if I would be the NIH director, and he brought me down to the White House, and I said no. And I thought that would be the end of my relationship with him, and that would be the end of my access. And as it turned out, he said something to me that made me realize what an amazing guy he is. He looked me in the eye and he said, I've always respected you a lot for all you've done and doing, and I respect you even more now. And I said, well, he's just saying that, and then he's going to forget about me. And like about 2 weeks later, he invited me down to a lunch at the White House. So, it just was really an extraordinary experience. Well, I first explained the pros and cons of that to Scooter Libby, and then to Carol Kuntz, who was a woman who worked closely with the vice president. And then they said, well, the vice president needs to hear this. So they brought me into the White House to explain it to the vice president. The vice president wanted very much to take smallpox off the table. In other words, he said that, there are certain things that we just want to eliminate the possibility that there'll be a real problem here. So one of the things that was not very well articulated by some is that smallpox is an interesting disease. If you had smallpox and I contracted it from you, I would have a grace period of a few days that you could actually vaccinate me even after I got exposed. And that would protect me from getting smallpox. Since smallpox, as effective a vaccine as it is, has some rare but nonetheless potentially very serious toxic side effects. If you're immunosuppressed, it could be deadly. If you're one of those people who have this strange myocarditis associated with it. So if you're in the middle of an outbreak of smallpox and you want to vaccinate people, like go back multiple decades and you're in Africa, the risk of the toxicity is far less than the risk of the devastating effect of the disease. So even though we accepted the toxicities of the smallpox vaccine, back then it was because there was active smallpox out there. So what I explained to Carol and to Scooter and to the vice president is that we would have some time to vaccinate people. If you all of a sudden vaccinated the whole country again, you would wind up, given the unlikelihood that you're going to have a bioterror smallpox attack that would not allow you to then vaccinate around the people who were infected. I think the weight of the waiting, getting a stockpile, is infinitely better than just feeling better about vaccinating everybody. And I presented it in a very articulate, simple way. The vice president is a very smart guy. He got it, and Scooter got it, and Carol got it. So then we decided that we would not globally vaccinate the entire country. And by the way, the country would not have accepted being vaccinated. So we knew that. It was sort of like a fail-safe. And I said, Mr. Vice President, by the way, even when you're offering it to the first responders, many of them didn't want to take it. So this idea about kind of saying everybody should take it, it didn't make any sense. So he listened to the data. I didn't directly, personally persuade him, but what was going on was something that I would say dueling press appearances, not dueling directly against each other, because I would be on many of the shows, Meet the Press, Face the Nation, talking about things, and then he would be saying certain things. And I made it a point, maybe he heard it or maybe not, of saying, because some in the press and others were trying to dump all over Governor Christie. And I was saying, I can understand, and this is what I learned over years of being in Washington, I can understand that the motivation of Governor Christie of wanting to do that was to protect the health of the people of his state. So I don't think he had nefarious motives at all. However, what I want to make known to the people who are listening is that the evidence strongly points to the fact that that is not an appropriate response to someone coming back from an Ebola area who are taking care of patients, because Ebola is not spread by someone who is well and not coughing and bleeding and throwing up and having diarrhea. If you're well, you may be or not incubating Ebola, but you're not going to spread it to someone else. So that when someone came back, we had a very good protocol. They would take their temperature. They would know that if they got sick, they would go. And I did that when I was taking care of our Ebola patients for, the couple that we had. One was very, very sick, is that I took my temperature twice a day, every day, and reported it to someone to make sure that I wasn't somehow accidentally incubating it. But to say that anybody who takes care of an Ebola patient automatically is quarantined, nobody would ever want to take care of an Ebola patient. And you would immediately drain the people who would be brave enough to go and do that. Yeah, there had been a lot of activity around after the drugs that in combination were proven to be totally life-saving for people who had access to certain drugs. It was called combination antiretroviral therapy, ART or HART, standing for highly active antiretroviral therapy. The results in the developed world were stunning. There was a lot of push around from some Christian groups and others about, what are we going to do for the developing world? So the president, in my discussions with him about, because by that time now we had been through anthrax together, we had been through H5N1, we'd been through a lot together. The president trusted me, so he called me in and said, I really want to do something that's transforming in the field of AIDS for the HIV-infected people in the developing world, particularly in Africa. Not really quite sure what it is. The Global Fund is being formed at the UN and UN level. He said, I'm a little bit skeptical of that because when you throw money into things, I don't like these multilateral things. I want to do something that we have control of. And he said, let's see if we can put something together because I firmly believe, he said, I, George W. Bush, firmly believe that as a rich country, we have a moral obligation that when others throughout the world are suffering and dying, that when we have the capability of preventing that from happening, that we should do something about it. So why don't we do something? I don't know what it's going to be. Why don't you go down to Africa, look around, talk to people, see what you can do, and then come back with a plan. And we started off small because we first went down there and it was right after the drug nevirapine was discovered that you give to a mother during pregnancy and to the baby, that with a very small amount of money, you could actually block mother-to-child transmission. So when I went down there with Tommy Thompson, who was the secretary of HHS at the time, we went around and we looked and we said, you could probably do an incredible amount with $500 million to prevent mother-to-child transmission. So I came back, I presented it to the president. He really liked it. But then with a bunch of amazing people in the White House, particularly Josh Bolten, Gary Etzen, Jay Lefkowitz, a guy who was my assistant who became indispensable, Mark Dybel, who then went on ultimately to be head of PEPFAR years later. We went back and said, okay, let's go back and see if we could do a plan that's much more transforming than just mother-to-child transmission, that actually prevents infections, cares for people, including orphans, and treats people with these life-saving drugs. And I said, Mr. President, that's going to cost a lot of money and billions of dollars. And he said, don't worry about it. Let me worry about it. This is something we really should do. And if it looks like it's worth doing, we're doing. And as it turned out, from the time I came back from Africa in 2002, came back in April, presented to him, then throughout the whole summer until we got into the end of 2002 and 2003, we were fine-tuning. Mark Dybel and I and Josh Bolten were fine-tuning, how many people, how many countries, how much will it cost, et cetera, et cetera. And we kept on through Josh Bolten getting back to the president, never knowing whether he was going to accept it or not, except we knew he wanted to do it. And then, towards the end of the year, as we went into January, he decided, A, I'm going to do it, and B, I'm going to announce it in the January 28, 2003 State of the Union address. And he did it unilaterally. Surprised the hell out of a lot of people because they said, my God, what is he really doing? But that was an example, in my mind, of amazing presidential leadership. Well, it is. I think we're doing better now. I think we're starting to see that things are evolving at a global level, where you have the global health security agenda, where we get other countries to have enough surveillance and transparency and collaboration so that when there are outbreaks in different parts of the world, you don't start from scratch. You talk to each other. Organizations are springing up. There's talks of emergency medical funds. Infrastructure is being built in different places. So we're doing better now than we were, but you're absolutely correct. It is very difficult when resources are scarce and you have a lot of problems that are currently real problems to get anyone, the Congress or the administration, to put in money for something that has not yet happened, that might not happen. I mean, when there's a lot of money around, you could say, okay, let's put a little money there. But when you already have extraordinary budgetary constraints, that's a real difficult thing to do, to convince somebody to put resources into something that might not ever happen. The thing you get concerned about is an outbreak of an infectious disease that's respiratory borne, that has a high degree of morbidity and mortality, such as a pandemic influenza. In 1918, we had a devastating pandemic that at the time killed from 50 to 100 million people, which in a population back in 1918, that would spell out into many, many, many more people. So that's the reason why we're doing things right now to try and develop more universal countermeasures against these things. And that's what we need resources for, which is the reason why it's a shame when you have budgetary constraints. And one of those things is what's called a universal influenza vaccine, namely a vaccine that's good against any strain of influenza, old strains, new strains, changing strains. That's something that we now have the scientific light at the end of the tunnel that will be able to do that. So yes, it keeps me up at night that one of these days that might happen, and you really want to be prepared for it. And one of the ways to be prepared is for an investment in basic and clinical and translational research. I mean, that's what I think we all need to understand. What people don't understand is they think that these two things are disconnected, that there's basic research and then there's research for HIV drugs or what have you to treat AIDS. So I'll give you an example. Basic research is probing. It's kind of like an incubator of new ideas for things in which you don't quite yet know what the applicability is going to be. But it's probing the unknown in biology. For us in the medical sciences, that's mostly the unknown in biology. For a physicist who's worrying about eclipses and things, that's science, that's in the unknown of the physical sciences. But I'll give you a really cogent example of basic research that has ultimately transformed diseases. So years and years ago, there were two investigators, Howard Temin and David Baltimore, who were working on trying to figure out how DNA, when you're studying DNA codes for RNA, but what about if you have RNA, how does RNA reproduce itself? So because DNA is the factory that makes the RNA that makes the protein. So they were trying to figure out what this was, and they found out that there's an enzyme that no one had ever identified before. It's called reverse transcriptase. So it goes backwards. Usually it's DNA, RNA, protein. This is RNA into DNA, then the DNA then codes the RNA. And what are you talking about? There's an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. It so happens, fast forward many years, reverse transcriptase is the enzyme that the HIV virus uses to get its HIV RNA to become DNA to get into your cell to start multiplying and making. So if they had not been doing basic research, we would likely not have any of the drugs that we have now for HIV. And I can guarantee you that when David Baltimore and Howard Temin were working on reverse transcriptase, they had no idea that we would have an HIV/AIDS epidemic many, many years later. And that's the beauty of the discovery. You just don't know. But if you shut off the basic research, then what you've done is you've shut off the incubator. And you only deal with things that you already have, about new things that'll happen in the future. As the leader of the Institute, I expect everybody to put 100% in, and if you're lazy, you're sloppy, you don't pull your weight, you're going to have a problem with me. If you work hard, you're going to love me because I'll give you a lot of responsibility. I will recognize you, and I will be very good to you. We didn't make any big-time mistakes when we were running that institute. What my wife was saying was a different story, because what Harold was talking about was running the institute, making sure that everything ran like a well-oiled machine. What my wife was talking about is that she came into the NIH first as a nurse, and I was away giving some talks in China, and she had heard about, on rounds, when you make rounds, I expect everybody to know everything about the patient, to be able to present it in a crisp, articulate way. I need everybody knowing all the things that are going on because I think it's a sacred privilege to be able to take care of the patient. Every once in a while, not always, you get somebody that's sloppy, that, they're presenting the patient, they don't know what the laboratory data is, and she had heard that when people are like that, I don't suffer that very lightly. If you're going to take the responsibility of putting somebody's life in your hands, you better know what's going on with the patient. And one of the things that I would not like at all when someone is presenting a patient to you and they're going through, and the patient has, let me see, what's this? If you don't know in your head what's going on with your patient, you were going to have a trouble with me. So that's what she thought, well, I was this really bad guy. But I wasn't, because if you were really good and you did your job well, we were great. I loved you and you loved me. There was no problem. So she came in and heard from people who, stories get magnified, legends get magnified. So people were painting my demand for protection, sometimes in a little bit hyperbolic way. And that's what she heard when she came in. I met her over the bed of a patient. She had been at the NIH for a few weeks while I was away in China giving a lecture. We had a patient who was from Brazil. He only spoke Portuguese. Chris had just come back from 2 years in Project Hope in a small place on the northeastern part of Brazil called Maceió. And she ran a clinic there for 2 years. And she went from there and came to the NIH. So she was fluent in Portuguese. When she came, she said, who runs the show? Who's the boss here? And they said, oh, it's this guy Fauci. Be careful, because he's very demanding. So she had heard that I was a very demanding person. So when I went in to see this patient, he was a Brazilian senator, and he had one of the old diseases, the vasculitis, where he had ulcers on his leg, and I was making sure that we took care of him very well, and he needed to rest and elevate his legs so as to not have the breakdown of the skin. So the last rounds before he was going to go home. So I said, I really want to give this guy instructions about what he needs to do when he goes home. I said, does anybody speak Portuguese? They said, we have this new nurse, Christine Grady, who just came back from Brazil. She speaks Portuguese. So she came in, and I told the guy, in a very serious, I says, Mr. Such and Such, I need you when you go home. You need to rest. You need to elevate your legs. You need to do this, and you need to do that. So she gets there, and she goes, blah, in Portuguese to the guy. And he tells her in Portuguese, this guy must be nuts. I've been sitting in this bed for weeks. I'm going to go there. I'm going to go to the Copacabana. I'm going to go to the beach. I'm going to dance. I'm going to drink caipirinhas. So that's what I'm going to do. And she didn't know what to do. So she gulped, and she turned around and instinctively said, he said, fine, he'll agree with you. And I says, okay, fine, that's great. So I was struck by her beauty and her grace, and I said, really nice looking new nurse. And so I went back, and about a week or so later, I decided, let me just take a chance and ask her out to dinner. So I told the head nurse on the ward, would you please have Christine Grady come to my office? And my office at the time was right in the clinical center in Building 10. So when she heard that, she said, oh my goodness, somehow he found out that I lied to him. That's the end of my career here at NIH. So she came into my office, and she sat down very nervously, and I just looked at her and I said, how would you like to go out to dinner? and she just sort of, her mouth dropped and for about 5 seconds, but she recovered very well. And she said, of course, I would love to. And then that was it. That's how we got to start going out. It's a combination of prioritization. And when you get a certain amount of experience, you know what you have, where you really do have to spend time on and things that you could just blow off. The other thing that I've done is that in the operation at the Institute, which remember is a $5 billion institute, and we have a lot of responsibilities, malaria, tuberculosis, things like that. My style of leadership is that I set the fundamental principles of where I think we should be going. I am very clear in what I expect. So the one thing that people will tell you in my institute, there's no ambiguity about where Tony wants to go with this. But balancing that, I surround myself with the very brightest people I could find, because I don't want to necessarily be the smartest person in the room all the time. I surround myself with the very brightest people, and I don't micromanage them. I say, this is where we need to go. You know, I don't go off and never check what's going on, and I say, let me know how I can help. If you need any trouble, we'll do it, but here's where I want to go. When it comes to things like the development of AIDS drugs, I said, here's what the goal is going to be. So there are certain things that I delegate, I don't micromanage, and you pick the very best people. There are certain things that you have to do, like when the Congress asks you to testify in the middle of a crisis like Ebola or Zika or anthrax, that just consumes a lot of your time. So if you didn't have a good team to continue the good work that you've already, they know what you want. When you're a micromanager or you don't have a vision, and for some reason or other, you get called away. You could get called away in a crisis, or you can get called away because you're sick or whatever it is. Then the people back there, they don't have any idea what they're doing. But when you make it really clear that here's where we're going, then in the middle of the anthrax attacks, which were, we didn't know whether the next attack was going to be something that would wipe us out. I would say I spent more time in the White House in the Situation Room during that fall of 2001, because the anthrax came, remember, right after 9/11, that those few months that I literally lived in the White House and before congressional committees and on television trying to calm the public, everything back home would have gone to pieces if I didn't have a group that I trained, that I gave them the vision, and that I didn't micromanage them so that they knew how to take care of things when I wasn't there. And I think that's really one of the major secrets of delegate the things, but don't delegate in a complete open-ended way. You say, here's where we're going. If you don't agree with that direction, tell me, we'll discuss it, and you might convince me that we want to go in a different direction. But then I won't micromanage you. I have a strange physiologic. I don't want anybody who's listening to this to have to do that. I usually, at times like that, I don't even leave. I don't even eat. I don't even leave work until, during the crises of Ebola, when Nina Pham and Amber Vinson got infected, and we were not sure whether they was going to be spread in this country. I was in my office until 11, 12 o'clock. Maybe I would grab a sandwich and do it. And I have a spectacular wife who has been through all of these crises with me, who's a professional in her own right, who's been amazingly supportive and understanding of that. Sometimes you just can't, let's go home and have dinner type. It doesn't work. You don't go home and have dinner when you're in the middle of an anthrax crisis. Well, actually, we had a deal when my girls were growing up. Thanks to the what's the right word? The generosity, emotional generosity of my wife, that we felt that we really needed to eat together. So they always tell you, don't eat a meal before you go to bed. Well, for many years, my daughters and my wife and I would eat a meal like late, because I would stay at work until 8:30, 8:45, get home. I live in Northwest DC, so it takes 15, 18 minutes to get to the NIH. So I would come back home at 9 o'clock, 9:15, and we would eat. Now the kids, interestingly, they were all athletes and different things after school. So they would go to school, they would come back, they would go rowing or cross country or all the things they did. They'd come back, they'd have a little snack, they'd do their homework, and then they'd come and we'd eat together. So I would see them almost all the time, but it was at a bizarre situation. On a regular night, I sleep about 5 hours, maybe a little, about 5 hours and 10 minutes. When we have crises, the adrenaline is so high that there were certain crises components there that it harkened back to my internship and residency day, where you had to do the things that you mentioned, that my regular, quote, day job. You have to brief the president in the Situation Room. You get called down to the Congress by the leadership to brief them, sometimes individually, sometimes as a group, and then you got to go back down and be on Racial Maddow late at night. Sometimes I do, and there are certain things that I do that music is very distracting and I can't do it. But there are other things that I do that music is really very soothing. And I'm an inveterate Beatles fan, Eagles fan, America fan. It just, dates me. But when I could listen to that and do certain things without being distracted. When I'm trying to write a commencement address or write it's impossible. It has to be completely quiet. Even a soothing, Mozart doesn't help me. Well, the museum that I really enjoy is the Air and Space Museum. I just, that's a great. I don't have time to go to museums a lot, but I have this thing about history. I really like the history of our country, particularly the books that I read and I focus on a lot, and I'm just fascinated by what happened in the 30s and the late 30s in Europe with World War II. You can read multiple different versions of that. I love Rick Atkinson's books on war. He's a phenomenal writer, Pulitzer Prize winner. He's really fantastic. So that era of history fascinates me, how we could have gone so wrong. No, I don't. I'm just going to keep working until I feel, and I think I have a pretty good radar screen for that I'm not at the top of my game. And right now, I think I'm even more than on the top of my game, because if you keep your energy up and you build on experience, that's really the ticket, And I'm in a field where accumulation of knowledge and experience in difficult situations make you well suited to play a very special role. If you don't learn from experiences, then you can just burn out and run out of time. But I don't really think about retiring.